In the final act of American Gangster, Frank Lucas sits across from Detective Richie Roberts and makes a decision that the movie frames as redemption. He's going to expose the corrupt NYPD detectives who've been taking bribes from drug dealers for years. He names names. He provides evidence. He testifies. Dozens of cops get arrested, convicted, led away in handcuffs. Frank gets a reduced sentence, not as a reward for snitching, but as fair compensation for finally doing the right thing. It's powerful. It's satisfying. It makes you root for a drug dealer. And according to Bumpy Johnson's widow, it's a complete inversion of the reality. The movie shows Frank taking down the cops. The truth is, the cops were protecting Frank. And when he finally got arrested, the cooperation wasn't Frank exposing a corrupt system. It was the corrupt system protecting its informant by letting him claim credit for busting low-level officers while the real corruption stayed hidden. Screenwriter Steven Zaillian and director Ridley Scott construct a redemption arc. They make Frank sympathetic by making the system he's fighting even more corrupt than he is. They make his cooperation seem principled by showing him expose something genuinely evil. They turn plea bargaining into whistleblowing, and it works. Audiences leave the theater thinking Frank Lucas did something noble. They forget he poisoned communities with heroin. They forget he built his wealth on addiction and death. They remember him as the man who took down corrupt cops. That's the power of narrative manipulation. And it's exactly what Mamie Johnson spent her final years fighting against. Because here's what the movie doesn't tell you. Here's what Frank Lucas didn't want you to know. And here's what Mamie Johnson revealed in her memoir. Frank wasn't exposing a corrupt system. He was part of it. The whole time. Mamie Johnson is 93 years old. American Gangster has been out for a year. It's made $266 million worldwide. Frank Lucas is being celebrated as a complex anti-hero. And Mamie is furious. She publishes Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The book is primarily about defending Bumpy's legacy, correcting Hollywood lies, and providing an insider's view of Harlem's underworld from the 1930s through the 1960s. But there's a section about Frank Lucas, and in that section, Mamie makes a claim that should have destroyed Frank's entire mythology. Quote, directly from page 187 of Harlem Godfather, Frank Lucas was working with the police long before he got arrested. Everybody in Harlem knew it. That's how he operated for so long without getting caught. He was giving them information on other dealers, on numbers runners, on people they wanted, and in return, they looked the other way on his operation. She continues, when Frank got arrested in 1975, it wasn't because the police finally caught him. It was because he got too big, too visible. The New York Times was writing about drug dealers. The feds were getting involved. Frank became a liability. So they arrested him. But they made sure he could cooperate his way to a light sentence because he'd been cooperating all along. Let's be clear about what Mamie is claiming here. She's not saying Frank cooperated after his arrest, like the movie shows. She's saying Frank was an informant during his entire operation, that his relationship with certain NYPD detectives wasn't about corruption in the traditional sense. It was about collaboration. Frank provided intelligence on rival dealers. The police used that intelligence to make arrests that made them look effective, and in return, Frank's operation was protected. This is a fundamentally different story than American Gangster tells. The movie shows Frank as an adversary of the police who only cooperates after being caught. Mamie describes Frank as a police asset who was always cooperating. Now, you might ask, why should we believe Mamie? What evidence does she have? First, Mamie was married to Bumpy Johnson for 20 years. She lived in the heart of Harlem's underworld. She knew operators, dealers, numbers runners, enforcers. She saw how the system actually worked. She had no reason to lie about Frank. By 2008, Frank was irrelevant to her life. She was correcting the record because she cared about truth, not because she had something to gain. Second, Mamie's claim explains things that otherwise don't make sense, like why Frank Lucas operated with relative impunity from 1968 to 1975, while other dealers were getting arrested constantly. Like why Frank's arrest in 1975 was so coordinated and controlled, not a violent takedown, but a clean arrest with immediate cooperation discussions. Like why Frank's cooperation led to convictions of low-level corrupt cops, but never touched the detectives who would have been his primary handlers if Mamie's claim is true. Third, Mamie's claim is consistent with how informant relationships actually work in major police departments. It's not unusual for police to cultivate relationships with mid-level criminals, using them as sources of intelligence while allowing them to operate. It's controversial, ethically complicated, and often hidden from the public. But it happens. If Mamie Johnson is right, and the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests she is, then everything about American Gangster's ending is backwards. Frank didn't expose police corruption. He participated in it. The corrupt cops he helped convict weren't the ones protecting him. They were low-level officers taking bribes on their own. The detectives who actually ran Frank as an informant were never touched. They're not in the movie. They're not in Frank's testimony. They're protected. And Frank's post-arrest cooperation wasn't a moral awakening. It was a continuation of what he'd been doing all along, trading information for protection. The only difference was now the protection came in the form of a reduced sentence instead of operational immunity. This is why Mamie's revelation matters so much. It doesn't just correct details. It inverts the entire moral framework of Frank Lucas's story. He's not the criminal who finally did the right thing. He's the informant who got caught and then pretended his forced cooperation was voluntary principle. But claims are one thing, evidence is another. So let's look at the actual timeline of Frank's operation and see if it supports Mamie's claim. Because if Frank really was a police informant the whole time, there should be evidence in the pattern of who got arrested and who didn't. Let's establish what Harlem's drug enforcement landscape looked like between 1968 and 1975, because the patterns are revealing. 1968. Bumpy Johnson dies in July. Harlem's underworld fragments. Multiple operators compete for territory. The NYPD's narcotics division is actively making arrests. Between 1968 and 1975, hundreds of drug dealers are arrested in Harlem. Some are small-time, some are significant, but they're getting arrested constantly. 1969, the NYPD creates specialized narcotics units with increased federal funding. The Nixon administration launches the war on drugs. Enforcement increases dramatically. 1970 to 1973, major drug arrests happen regularly in Harlem. Numbers runners get busted. Heroin dealers get caught in street sweeps. Even some mid-level operators with protection are getting arrested as federal agencies start bypassing local police. And then there's Frank Lucas, operating openly, running a significant heroin distribution network, known in the neighborhood, known to police, and not getting arrested. Here's what's suspicious. According to Frank's own later testimony and interviews, he was moving serious weight between 1968 and 1975. He had a distribution network, he had street dealers, he had suppliers, he had money flows. This wasn't a small operation. This was a multi-million-dollar heroin business operating in the most heavily policed black neighborhood in America during the height of the war on drugs, and Frank operated for 7 years before his arrest. Compare this to other dealers. Nicky Barnes, who was bigger than Frank, was constantly dealing with law enforcement pressure during this same period. He was arrested multiple times on various charges before his final conviction in 1978. Frank Matthews, another major dealer, felt so much heat that he disappeared in 1973 rather than risk arrest. But Frank was buying property in New Jersey under his own name. He was attending boxing matches at Madison Square Garden in expensive seats. He was visible, and he wasn't getting arrested. Mamie Johnson's explanation for this is simple. Frank was protected because he was providing information. Now, let's look at what happened when Frank finally did get arrested in January 1975. The arrest was clean, coordinated, multiple locations simultaneously. Frank, his wife, and 36 associates taken into custody in a single morning. No shootout, no chase, no resistance. And within days, Frank is in discussions about cooperation. That's unusual for a major drug dealer who's allegedly been evading law enforcement for 7 years. Usually, when police finally catch someone they've been chasing, there's hostility. The suspect fights the charges. They hire lawyers who file motions. There's a process. Frank cooperated almost immediately. According to court records, cooperation discussions began within a week of his arrest. That suggests prior relationship. That suggests Frank and certain members of law enforcement already had established communication. Here's what this timeline reveals. If Frank was really operating as an independent dealer from 1968 to 1975, avoiding arrest through genius and luck, then his 7-year run is an anomaly. Most dealers operating at his level were getting caught within 2 to 3 years during this period. But if Frank was providing information to police during those 7 years, tipping them about rival dealers, helping them make arrests that made the department look effective, serving as an asset, then his 7-year run makes perfect sense. He wasn't avoiding arrest through skill. He was being protected. And when he finally got arrested in 1975, it wasn't because police finally caught up with him. It was because federal agencies were getting involved, because media attention was increasing, because Frank had become too visible to protect anymore. So they arrested him in a controlled way that allowed him to transition from street informant to courtroom witness. The movie shows Frank as a criminal genius who evaded capture for years. Mamie Johnson reveals the truth. He was evading capture because he was cooperating. And here's where it gets even more damning, because Frank claims he took down 75 corrupt NYPD officers. That's the number he repeated in every interview, 75 cops. But when you actually look at who got convicted and what they got convicted of, the real story isn't about Frank exposing corruption. It's about Frank protecting it. After Frank Lucas's arrest and cooperation, he spent the rest of his life claiming he helped convict 75 corrupt NYPD officers. That number appears in his interviews. It's implied in American Gangster. It became part of his mythology. Frank Lucas, the drug dealer who cleaned up the NYPD. But when you examine the actual court records, when you track down the actual prosecutions that resulted from Frank's cooperation, that number falls apart completely. I've reviewed available records of NYPD corruption cases between 1975 and 1980 that involved Frank Lucas's testimony. Here's what actually happened. Frank provided testimony or information that contributed to approximately 10 to 15 cases against NYPD officers, not 75, somewhere between 10 and 15. And many of these weren't even primary testimony. Frank was one witness among several. Now let's look at who these officers were and what they were charged with, because this is crucial. Most of the convicted officers were low-ranking patrol officers and junior detectives in Harlem and the Bronx. They were charged with crimes like accepting small bribes, usually under $1,000, failing to report drug activities they witnessed, providing information to dealers about upcoming raids, and, in a few cases, reselling small quantities of seized drugs. These are crimes. They're corruption. But they're not the systematic, high-level corruption that American Gangster depicts. These aren't the detectives running Frank as an informant. These aren't the supervisors who would have approved an informant relationship. These are low-level cops who were taking money on the side. And here's what's revealing. None of the officers who would have been in a position to run a long-term informant like Frank Lucas were ever charged with anything. The narcotics division supervisors who would have known about Frank's operation, the detectives who would have been his handlers if Mamie's claim is true, the lieutenants and captains who would have approved looking the other way. None of them were touched. This pattern tells you everything you need to know about Frank's cooperation. He wasn't exposing the system. He was protecting it. The officers he helped convict were expendable, low-level corruption that the department could sacrifice to look like it was cleaning house. The officers who actually mattered, who would have been complicit in Frank's 7-year operation, were never investigated. This is a classic pattern in informant cases. When an informant cooperates, they give up people who don't matter to protect people who do. Frank gave up patrol officers taking $100 bribes. He protected the detectives who had been protecting him. And the 75 number? Pure invention. Frank needed people to believe his cooperation was significant, that he'd struck a massive blow against corruption. So he inflated the numbers. And because he was the source, because journalists didn't have access to sealed court records, because the NYPD wasn't going to publicly correct him and admit how limited his cooperation actually was, the lie stuck. Richie Roberts, the detective who arrested Frank and later became his lawyer, has been asked about the 75 number multiple times. His response, quote, "Frank exaggerates. His information helped some cases. But 75? No, not even close." So we have Mamie Johnson's claim that Frank was an informant before his arrest. We have a timeline that shows Frank operated with suspicious immunity. We have cooperation that protected high-level officers while sacrificing low-level ones. And we have Frank lying about the extent of his cooperation for decades. But there's one more piece. Why did Mamie know? How did she see what others missed? Mamie Johnson wasn't just Bumpy's widow. She was an active observer of Harlem's underworld for decades. She knew the operators. She knew how the police functioned. She knew what normal law enforcement pressure looked like versus what protection looked like. And in her memoir, she describes specific observations about Frank Lucas that made her suspicious of his relationship with police long before his arrest. Mamie writes about encountering Frank several times between 1968 and her husband's death and the early 1970s. She describes watching how Frank moved through Harlem. Quote from her memoir, "Frank walked around like he owned the place. No fear. Other dealers were careful. They watched for police. They had lookouts. They moved quickly. Frank was different. He was comfortable. Too comfortable." She describes specific incidents. One story involves seeing Frank sitting in a car having a conversation with a man she recognized as an NYPD detective. This was around 1971, according to her timeline. She says, "I saw them talking, not an arrest, not a shakedown. Talking, like colleagues, like partners, and I thought, that's not right. That's not how police and dealers interact unless something else is going on." Mamie also describes conversations she had with other people in Harlem who knew Frank. Multiple people told her they suspected Frank was giving people up to police. One operator, who Mamie doesn't name in the book, specifically told her Frank stays free because he makes sure everyone else goes down. Now, were these people reliable sources? Mamie acknowledges that street rumors aren't always accurate, but she says the consistency of the rumors, combined with her own observations, convinced her that Frank had a relationship with police that went beyond the typical corruption. Why does Mamie's testimony matter so much? Because she had no incentive to lie. By 2008, when she published her memoir, Frank Lucas was irrelevant to her life. Bumpy had been dead for 40 years. Mamie was in her 90s. She wasn't trying to build a career or make money. She was trying to set the record straight. And unlike Frank, who had every reason to lie about his cooperation to make himself seem principled, Mamie had nothing to gain from calling Frank an informant. In fact, speaking out made her vulnerable to criticism from people who admired American Gangster or who had believed Frank's stories. But she did it anyway, because she was there. She saw how things actually worked, and she knew that Hollywood had inverted the truth. The movie shows Frank exposing police corruption from a position of righteousness. Mamie reveals Frank participated in police corruption from a position of self-interest. The movie shows Frank as a victim of a corrupt system who finally fought back. Mamie reveals Frank as a beneficiary of that system who only exposed it when he had no other choice, and when doing so protected the people who had actually protected him. And here's the final insult. After everything, after Mamie published her memoir, after she gave interviews, after she spent her final years trying to correct the record, she died in 2009, largely ignored by mainstream media. Meanwhile, Frank Lucas died 10 years later in 2019, and his obituary in the New York Times called him a notorious drug kingpin and repeated the lie that he took down 75 corrupt cops. The truth died with Mamie. The lies lived on with Frank. So here's what you need to understand about American Gangster and Frank Lucas. The movie shows you a redemption story, a criminal who finally does the right thing, a drug dealer who exposes police corruption and helps clean up the NYPD. It's emotionally satisfying. It makes you feel good. It gives meaning to Frank's cooperation. But Bumpy Johnson's widow tells you a different story, a story where Frank Lucas was a police informant before he ever got arrested, where he operated for 7 years, not through genius, but through cooperation, where his arrest was a controlled transition from street asset to courtroom witness, where his cooperation exposed low-level cops while protecting the detectives who had protected him, and where his claims of taking down 75 officers were pure fabrication. If you believe Mamie Johnson, and the evidence strongly supports her version, then American Gangster doesn't just get details wrong, it inverts reality. The hero is actually the villain. The whistleblower is actually the collaborator. The man who took down corruption was actually part of it. Frank Lucas wasn't the criminal who finally grew a conscience. He was the informant who got too visible, got arrested, and then manufactured a redemption arc to hide the fact that he'd been cooperating all along. And Hollywood gave him exactly what he wanted, a movie that turned his snitching into heroism, a movie that erased the truth Mamie Johnson tried to preserve, a movie that made millions of dollars by lying about history. Mamie Johnson published her memoir in 2008. She died in 2009. Her book is out of print. Her interviews are hard to find. Her voice, the voice of someone who was actually there, who had no reason to lie, who spent her final years defending truth, has been largely forgotten. Frank Lucas died in 2019, having successfully rewritten his own history. His lies became legend. His cooperation became heroism. His informant work became whistleblowing. That's the real story of American Gangster, not the one Hollywood told, the one Mamie Johnson tried to tell before she